Hi, this is Mr. Curtis, and today what we're going to be talking about is ecology. And I wanted to start first by showing you a chart of our beloved Wisconsin, and it shows where all the dairy farms are, which is kind of interesting. At least I find it interesting. First of all, how come there's no dairy farms there? And why are there so few dairy farms here? And why are there few dairy farms here? Oops, I knew I was going to do that. And going back to here, why are there so few dairy farms right there? Each of those has an answer, and see if you can come up with them, and we'll talk about them when we get together. Let's start by breaking down the word ecology, and we start first with ekal, which is Greek for home or house. And ology, hopefully you remember from our Latin studies, literally means study of. So if you put them all together, you get the study of home. But really, ecology has come to mean the study of how living and non-living things interact. Now, I always like to talk about the things that you really should know about a unit that we're talking about. So, 3 things you need to know. Everything is linked. Now, I want you to take and think of two living things. Write it down and think about how they are linked together. And if you can't think of how they're linked together, then we'll talk about them in class. Number 2. Everything you do affects the environment, mostly in a bad way. So the whole idea is to reduce our impact on the environment because basically everything we do hurts the environment. For example, right now in the news there's a lot about plastic straws. And there's many communities in the United States who are banning plastic straws because they know that they end up out into the ocean like here. This is all single-use plastic items. Water bottles, all kinds of containers, paint stuff. I mean, you name it, it's out there. And this oftentimes ends up not recycled, but out into the ocean. Yuck. There's this great company called For Ocean, and they are spending all of their resources cleaning up the ocean of plastics, and then they come back and they convert these plastics into items that can be sold. It's really quite a neat organization. I suggest you check them out. And the third thing, in order for something to live, something else must die. That is kind of the harsh reality sometimes. We think about, here's a loon, common loon, eating a bluegill. Hard to tell from this side, but obviously going to have a meal. This bear is having a fish meal, but bears, of course, eat lots of other things. This is a Cooper's hawk, and it's feeding on our state bird. Again, everything. In order to live, something else must die. That's the harsh reality of nature. Let's break a couple other words down into groups, into things, starting with abiotic. Now there's really 3 parts to this word. Anytime you see a, that is going to mean without. And I want you to come up and brainstorm 3 other words that begin with A and see if it means without. Bio, that means life. And ic, from our studies of Greek and Latin, that means pertaining to. So if you put them all together, it's pertaining to non-living things. Biotic would be just the opposite. This would be pertaining to living things. When you look at an area, you want to oftentimes look at something called the carrying capacity. Now, capacity you may have heard of before. For example, Lambeau Field in Green Bay has a seating capacity of around 80,000 people. In other words, they'll sell tickets out to that, but anything above that, they're done. You're out of luck. Carrying capacity refers to the number of animals of a species that can live in an area. The number of animals that can live in an area. For example, if you notice carefully here, you see there's nothing growing at a certain level. This is something called the browse line, and that's caused by deer. Too many deer have been snarfing on this arborvitae trees. Too many deer have been eating this farmer's sorghum field. Look at it. It's just, it's all trampled down here. This probably indicates that deer are reaching the carrying capacity of this area. I want to look at a graph showing carrying capacity. Over here is going to be the number of animals, and then over here is going to be time. By the way, which is the independent and which is the dependent variable? If we take that and look at the here, now let's assume that this orange arrow is the carrying capacity. Now let's say that a population of fish in a pond starts out here and it goes up like here. Tell me what you think is going to happen to the population of the fish once it reaches the carrying capacity. On the side of your sheet, I want you to draw a little graph of your own and tell me, if this is the carrying capacity line, what do you think is going to happen next? Okay, you should have had plenty of time to draw a little chart. Now, what really does happen with carrying capacity? As a species goes up to this line, it actually will go above the carrying capacity. However, after it goes up here, there's not enough food, space, and the resources are limited, so the population begins to come down. The population will go below the carrying capacity, and then it comes back up and down and up and down, and it will continue to cycle like this over and over and over. This is actually a normal thing for most species. For example, in northern Wisconsin, the ruffed grouse. I'll pull up a picture of ruffed grouse here. They have a cycle that lasts 10 years. So the population goes way up and then goes down and comes back up, and it takes 10 years for that to go through things. This is a chart that shows the populations of deer in Wisconsin. And as you can see, the populations since 1960 have been going up and up and up. Would you guess that they have reached the carrying capacity? No, they have not. However, look at the goal that the DNR wants to have. They want the population to be here, but the population is way up here. What does that tell you? Living things are going to be classified in two different ways. There's something called producers and something called consumers. Sometimes you hear of consumers as what people are when they go shopping. They buy things, and that's called consuming them. A producer is a living thing that makes its own food. it should be in. What kind of things out there make their own food? Consumers are living things that cannot make their own food. And so they must eat something else. We would be consumers. Why we talk about producers and consumers? Because it all comes together in something called a food web or chain. This is a typical food web or chain, showing how animals are related and dependent upon each other. Now, let's say in this area, we've got the producers and decomposers down here. You have the first layer of consumers called primary, then secondary, and tertiary, the upper level consumers. The primary consumers, what do they eat? They eat the producers. The secondary consumers, what do they eat? The primaries and the tertiaries and so on. Now, what if in this area all of the mountain lions were eliminated? What would happen? Well, look to see what's going to a mountain lion. Jackrabbit. Well, if there's no mountain lions around, guess what? That jackrabbit population is going to go sky high. And this is the problem that we're seeing in certain areas. If one animal is removed from this group, coyotes, for example, if coyotes were eliminated, look at all the things that go to a coyote. Their populations go sky high. So if all these animals go sky high, guess what happens to all these? Well, darn it. All of these animals, their population goes way down. So everything is interdependent. Here's another example of a food web or chain in action. This happens to be one of my favorite places in the world. This is something called the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone National Park. Gorgeous, gorgeous area. And in the Lamar Valley, almost all of the wolves were eliminated, gone. Here's where the Lamar Valley is. So here's Evansville, and Yellowstone is about 1,200 miles due west of here. And in Yellowstone Park, and in Yellowstone Park, you've got this whole beautiful valley. And it's really quite pretty. You have meandering streams that come through here, and you see all kinds of primary consumers out there eating the grasses and so on. Well, the problem was this. Because there were no wolves, there were way too many herbivores, way too many consumers eating too much vegetation. And so it would eliminate the vegetation along the sides of these streams, and when there ever was some rain, the streams would become muddy, and all that mud would go downstream. And it made for a big mess. It's pretty hard to fish that stuff. So in 1995, the government started to re-release wolves back into Yellowstone. And as the wolves started to be in Yellowstone, they started to eat the bison and the elk and some of the deer populations. And guess what happened? Look here. This is kind of a before and after. Look at the amount of vegetation here compared to the vegetation here. There's a lot more that's growing. Why is there more growing? Well, because there's less herbivores. There's less primary consumers eating the vegetation. Look at the populations of certain animals over the time. So you can see how the wolf population started up And you see how it's fluctuating? It's probably reached its carrying capacity. The elk population has gone down, but it's now leveled off. The cottonwood populations, that's a kind of tree, and the willow populations. And because you don't have you have more cottonwoods and more willows, now there's more food for beavers. And the beavers will produce what? Dams. The dams will also slow up that water and will allow for it to clear. So now in the Lamar Valley, you've got a lot more beautiful, clear streams with less times where it gets muddy, which means that certain Midwest fishermen, when they go out there, have more opportunities to fish the streams. So it's one of those situations where introducing the wolves has benefited a lot of species, and species including humans. All right, now there were a couple things that I wanted you to answer some questions on, and as always, make sure that you put a summary down at the end of your sheet. And we'll see you next time.